Well, hello again, everybody. This is John Arsick, Trading Perspectives. As always, we have our good friend, Sam Clement. Sam, say hello.
Hey, John. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Hope you're doing well.
I am.
We also have with us today fellow Oakworth associate Courtney Truss.
Hey.
How are you doing, Courtney?
I'm good. Glad to be here.
Okay, we have this extra voice because, we're sitting around thinking about ways to make this podcast a little bit more inclusive, and we realized we had Gen X taken care of, and we had Gen Z taken care of. We didn't have Gen Y taken care of, and we also didn't have, millennials, and we also didn't have a female perspective.
So now we're checking two more boxes.
Yeah,
now we're
you're
checking
welcome,
two more boxes, but also for those of you that know Courtney and know Oakworth Capital Bank, Courtney is full of a lot of questions. So it's very routine. After each podcast, she would come and ask these additional questions of me and Sam. So instead of having to
we're just skipping a step,
reinventing the wheel, we just decided, Courtney, I tell you what, why don't you just come on in and ask your questions, and that's just the way we're going to make it happen. What do you think about that?
That sounds good.
So, Courtney said she had some questions for us this week about, really all the vaccine mandates going on out there, and what could be some of the possible things that could happen with the private sector, public sector, just lots of question marks for Courtney.
And there's just a lot of question marks to everyone in general, whether you're over 100 employees or not, who's a federal contractor, nobody really knows what this is going to look like. So I think there's a lot of questions to be asked.
All right, so we're going to turn it over now to Ms. Truss. Courtney, what are some of the questions that you might have of us?
Well, I think kind of to Sam's point, what are the economic impacts that y'all see as, something for the private sector, for the employers?
Economic impacts in terms of, gee whiz, all of a sudden we've got these mandates coming down the pike. Well, I guess a lot of that would really have to do with whether or not their associates want to do it. First and foremost, but in terms of economic impact, mandating someone gets a shot probably is not going to change our business model. It's not going to change our forecast or our goals, our budgets, or, quarterly conversations or anything like that. So in terms of just how business functions, that shouldn't change it too much unless really, Sam, unless the employees or the associates decide they just aren't going to opt into that.
Well, and that's the thing I think that's important is, there's a good percent of people who are hesitant or not getting the vaccine, but I think within that group, I think an even smaller amount of them would be willing to lose their job over not getting a vaccine. So I think if you start to see a mandate actually be rolled out, I think you're going to see some of those people who are hesitant or saying they're not getting it right now, saying, okay, I think my job's a little more important than whatever this is I'm putting in my body.
Now, Sam, if I'm not mistaken, you were a little hesitant at first.
I'm not hesitant. I don't think that's the way I would describe it. It took a little longer
buddy,
than the at-risk people. I took a little longer.
Yes, you did.
I'm at risk in so many ways, and it took me a little bit. I said I was going to wait until I could go to Crestline Village and get it, and I did. And it worked out pretty well. I guess that was about a week or two later than other people at my at-risk categories. So, Courtney, how'd that go?
That's good. That's a good response. I think, obviously we're thinking of it from the perspective of the employee and whether or not they're willing to get vaccinated. But from the employer standpoint, we know right now it's hard to find good skilled workers, and there might be a scenario in certain industries or just in general in which employees don't want to get vaccinated. And so do you think if the employer is that stretched to have an employee do the job, keep the doors open, that they might be willing to take the risk of getting the fine versus having to let employees go?
Sam, I'm going to throw this to you.
I think absolutely. I think I heard an interesting comment from a business owner kind of late last year when they were already struggling for workers and saying this is the first time they feel like the employee's satisfaction was more important than the customer satisfaction because of how difficult it was to keep and retain employees. And so I think that's going to be part of it. I think if all it takes is a fine, and who knows what that would look like for an employee, but if that's the only added cost to keeping an employee versus what everyone knows to be the cost of going out and finding new employees, I think absolutely that it makes sense for people, if that's what it comes to just eating the fine themselves and considering it a cost of keeping your employees.
You see, you're being legitimate. I guess I'm so cynical, I would think people are just going to be very fraudulent about this. If you have a good employee that simply doesn't want to do it, I could very easily see some fast food joints, some small employers, whatnot, completely fake the test results.
Well, I don't even think they're going to need to get to that point. I think this is going to be so poorly rolled out, if this ever actually is rolled out, and we can get to that later. But I think it's going to be so poorly rolled out that there's no chance that there's any sort of checks and balances of who's actually getting tested and not. I mean, who's going to go to the Jacks in Sylacauga and see if your employees have been tested or vaccinated against COVID-19?
For those of you outside of Alabama, Jack's is a fast food joint. In Sylacauga is a
That's
town
my
about
point. Nobody outside of Alabama knows about it. Who's going to go there?
Well, you bring up a very good point. I mean, it's just, who's going to follow behind on this? And if businesses and employers are left to police themselves, they will find out ways to make sure that they don't police themselves too harshly, I think. So.
Well, and to that point, I mean, do y'all foresee, just like, the federal government stepped in and gave assistance through COVID to the private sector, do you see the federal government coming in and giving any assistance or incentivizing companies to follow this mandate?
Well, I mean, kind of to Sam's point, I think the devil in all this is going to be in the details, and to come out and mandate that this is going to happen doesn't make it thus. I mean, if you're going to sit there and have such an overreaching sort of mandate that this happen, and you don't give people the proper processes or protocol and really develop a way that you can test it, it's pointless to even discuss it. It's there's no way to police it, no way to measure it. It's just simply not going to get done. And Sam and I talk about it plenty. That which gets measured gets done. Mm-hmm. And people are incented, will do what they're incented to do. And since I can't envision a way that the federal government would be able to adequately check behind every single employer, every single employee to make sure that people are being tested once a month. I mean, going to the Jacks in Sylacauga, making sure that happens. So, in terms of help for the private sector, I think this ultimately probably will get pushed back.
Well, I think talking about how we would even go about checking who's getting vaccinated or not kind of skips over the biggest problem in all this, and that's the federal government not even having the right to enforce vaccine mandates. I mean, there's a 115-year-old precedent about the states having the right to enact vaccination mandates, and it's not something that's given to the federal government. And so I think that's going to be a huge problem. I think we've seen some states already push back on it. And my hope is that in this, the states would be the ones that would do the pushing back on it, have a state case against the federal government, and not have it end up being on, say, the Jacks from Sylacauga to push back on the vaccine mandate.
And for those
of you, again, there is a Jacks in Sylacauga.
Well, I'm sure. Yeah, actually, I think there is. Listen, Jack's burgers are very mediocre, but the fried chicken actually is quite good.
I'll take the word for that. I haven't had it.
Well, but I think to both of your points, if we are able to get 70% or whatever we deem as herd immunity in the United States, which is, I assume, right, the ultimate goal.
Well, I thought the original goal was 15 days to flatten the curve, and then that all got pushed back.
Well, regardless, where people don't have to wear a mask and that we can fully open up, and I guess doing air quotes isn't helpful for a podcast, but where we can open up, that people are able to go about their daily lives. And, that might be that we already are there. But I guess I'm trying to think, is there an economic impact to us having herd immunity and being able for businesses fully to open up, fully to staff up, not having to space things out with COVID protocol?
I don't think so. I think they've really ruined the possibility of having a carrot to hang in front of people to incentivize them to, at one point it was get your vaccine and you don't have to wear your mask anymore. Originally, like I said, it was 15 days to flatten the curve, just stay in for 2 weeks and then we'll all go back to normal after this. There's been so many promises that have been reneged on that it's hard for me to believe any of whatever their next promise is, whether it's 80, 90%. I don't believe herd immunity is something that will even reach. This seems to be endemic from what I've read now, and it seems like there's always going to be a concern around it, and this is just going to become some sort of a new normal. And so I think we need to be pushing back on continued regulation at some point because there's no end in sight.
I'd be inclined to agree with Sam on that because really, Courtney, I don't think it's businesses being hesitant to reopen. It's the restrictions that government has put on them. And, as long as the government will continue to put restrictions on businesses, that's what's been a deterrent to economic growth. Now, Those states which have opened up more fully and more completely, they seem to be more economically vibrant right now. And, those states which still have some restrictions on it are lagging a little bit behind. So in terms of business wants to get back at it. They want to get back at it. And it's the local politicians that are keeping those companies down. That's what I think.
Yeah.
It seems like there hasn't been as much pushback as I would have expected from some of the state governments against this. I mean, this is something that has very clearly had precedence. Like I said, there's Supreme Court cases that had a 7-2 vote saying that this was a state's right to enact vaccine mandates. And yet the federal government saying, okay, we're going to do it, and then just come at us after. They're essentially expecting to have lots of these cases against them. So I'm kind of taken back by their confidence on this.
But wasn't it also other private companies that were appreciative in the fact that the federal government came down with this mandate, so it didn't make the private employer have to make that decision?
Well, that's the company's problem. They need to be able to deal with their own employees and not rely on somebody who doesn't have the right to enact a vaccine mandate, be the one who they can point the finger at.
But it might be that those local business owners aren't pushing the state to speak up against this, is what I'm saying.
Well, I mean, I'll tell you here at Oakworth, I mean, we've been debating whether or not what steps we were going to need to do for those people that didn't want to be vaccinated. We weren't going to get to the point where we were mandating it. And when the Federal Reserve or when the federal government announced this, we were like, okay, well, we'll just have to see whether or not Kay Ivey, the governor of our state, was going to enforce it as well. And so not believing that Kay was going to willingly go along with what the Washington had to say, we really hadn't thought about too much past that in a lot of ways. I mean, it's just one of those situations where you want to be able to provide a safe workspace, but at the same time, there is some question marks about whether or not you should force employees or associates to do something which they have a fundamental disagreement with, for whatever reason, be it right or wrong. It's a tough call.
Yeah.
What do you think, Courtney?
I do think it's a tough call, and I'm glad I have people like you on our leadership that can make those decisions, and I don't have to.
Now, let me ask you two this. Now, what if all of a sudden you were working for an employer that mandated that you had to have a vaccine?
Well,
how would you respond to that?
Well, I would get a vaccine. That's what I'm saying. Obviously I'm not in the completely vaccine hesitant crowd. I already have my shots, but it seems like
I'm still unsure that you did.
I know, made it up.
It seems like this goes back.
I think you just left for the day.
It seems like
it's 4:30 on Friday a couple times.
It seems like to me intuitively that a large percentage of those people would probably hopefully want to keep their job over losing their job, especially if it got to the point where companies were firing people. It seems like they'd have that same problem somewhere else unless they went to a smaller company, right, which again is an arbitrary number. This 100-person employee is an arbitrary number. Same thing with their 6-foot distancing between people. It's all arbitrary, but they're going to have that same problem going anywhere else. I think that you may see a little benefit to some smaller companies under 100 employees say, come on,
until they hire so many people that all of a sudden they reach 100 employees.
Cannon to people to.
Well, that's you bring up a very good point on that, because that's something that obviously is just kind of a glaring sort of, not a red flag or bright light or whatnot, but I mean, do people that work at places that only employ 50 people, are they immune from COVID? Do they not need to be vaccinated, or are they not spreading it? Are they not susceptible to it?
Well, they don't spread it at the Emmys last night when there was hundreds of people in a tiny room indoors. That's not a super spreader.
Well, you're right. Or any of the football games we went to or watched on the television this past weekend. So I do agree with you. There is definitely an element of arbitrariness in terms of just 100 employees.
Kind of reminds me of what we talked about last week. The biggest pushback was the hypocrisy that we saw. I think it kind of goes back to that same sort of topic.
Wow.
Hypocrisy.
And we're all hypocrites.
Comes up when we talk about government a lot.
It does. Strangely enough. How about you, Courtney? What if Oakworth Capital Bank or any former employer of yours had said, you have to be vaccinated. And this is where we might have generational differences or maybe even other demographic differences.
Maybe. I think that I know that some women were hesitant just due to the nature of family planning and not knowing what statistics were out there about the shot. And I do think there's something to be said about the government telling me what I should do or take. That does bother me, but at the same time, I personally I have two doctors in the family, actually three, so I know just based off of their experience and their expertise that I needed to get the shot. So I didn't even think twice about it. But I think that a lot of people just don't like being told what to do. And I also fall into that sometimes. So I can see why, certain people might not say it's none of the government's business and it's overreaching. And, I get it. I get why that they would feel that way.
I think at some point, there's continue to be more proof that the vaccines are effective at preventing serious cases for the most part. At some point, I feel like if you're not getting the vaccine, you need to be taking on that extra risk. And we know for a fact it's not foolproof, it's not 100% effective. However, at some point, there's risks involved with everything. And if you're going to take the added risk of not getting the vaccine, I think you can't, drag the whole economy down for those people.
Well, wasn't it y'all who were talking about how certain employers were increasing cost of like health care to their employees who weren't vaccinated? I mean, it's the same thing. If you try to go get life insurance but you smoke, you're going to pay more. So it's, maybe that's the thought is like, okay, the employer's now going to pass the cost on to you for choosing that. It's up to you. You don't have to get vaccinated, but if you choose that, then you're going to pay a higher premium for, I guess, potential loss of productivity should you be out. I mean, I don't really know how they would justify that cost or how it all works out, but maybe that's a means of trying to get people to view it differently.
I think there's a huge difference between your employer mandating it and the government mandating it, and that's just me. Perhaps I'm just a product of where I live and when I grew up. But I mean, back when I was like Sam's age, which was a few years ago,
just a few,
I probably would have been bowing up and prancing around about how I wasn't going to get a vaccine. I probably would have been. Just like no way in God's green earth is someone doesn't know what in the hell they're talking about going to get me to do something I don't want to do. Now I've mellowed. And so I am just such a mellow, chill guy now that it didn't bother me quite so much. Your thoughts on that, Sam?
Well, I think that's where most people that are pushing back isn't necessarily against the vaccine itself. It's more hesitance towards someone else telling them to do it.
Right.
I think probably the majority of the people that are afraid of what's in the vaccine itself are probably putting other things into their body that are a lot worse for them than
like
the
a
vaccine.
cold beer or something
like
like
a
that?
Giant Mountain Dew or something like that. So there's a huge...
I think you're right.
There's a huge logical fallacy in being concerned about something that 98%, 99% of doctors are saying you should take. It seems like that's really where the hesitancy to me is the people, forcing it down before someone else makes their own decision for themselves whether they want to or not.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Especially when last year some of the people now pushing the hardest for it were also the most hesitant against it before the November election.
Are you,
That's
are
for
you
next
going
week.
back?
I was say, switching gears a little bit here.
Again with the hypocrisy.
Yes.
Well, Courtney, I'm not sure we answered all your questions. I mean, I guess you can kind of tell what we're thinking, that ultimately it probably shouldn't necessarily be a huge economic impact to mandate that employees get vaccinated unless employees want to make it thus. And we do believe, I strongly believe, that employers are going to do whatever they can to make employees happy. And, some of the larger employers that might be with their higher paid personnel, okay, you're going to have to pay an extra $100 a month. But with hourly workers and for those jobs in which employers are now having difficulty finding, it's going to be paying people underneath the table, just, okay, you're not really employed, but you are employed, and coming up with ways to for all intents and purposes, fake the test. Now, that's not my being cynical, but then again, my generation is supposed to be one of the more cynical ones.
Well, there you go.
There I have it, I think.
Yeah.
Well, guys, thank you all so much for listening. We always love to hear from you all. So if you have any questions or comments, by all means, please let us know. You can always drop us a line at tradingperspectives@oakworth.com, or you can leave us a review on the podcast outlet of your choice. As always, if you're interested in reading more, hearing more of what we have to say or how we think, please go to oakworth.com and take a look underneath the Thought Leadership tab for all sorts of good information. As always, Sam, I'm going to give you the last chance.
That's all I got.
And now, I'm also going to give Courtney the last chance.
That's all I got.
That's all I've got too. Y'all take care.